Today we're going to begin our first recording of the Cold War. The PowerPoint that you are seeing in this recording is downloaded on the website. It is many slides long, over 120 to be exact. These slides were prepared for the Cold War when I taught it before using a different book called A Hard and Bitter Peace. And so therefore, it doesn't coincide exactly with your book pages, but it does correspond roughly. So I'll make sure to point out in the recordings about the Cold War where these pages fit in with your book. We now know that the Cold War was a little more than 40-year long period of time in the second half of the 20th century in which the two new superpowers after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union, engaged in a series of tension and threats and intimidation back and forth in an effort to gain world domination. We've seen in class so far the origins of this conflict between the two superpowers. It had to do with ideologies, and we've identified what the communist ideology was, and based on the idea of Karl Marx, and which is based on the idea of equal and shared ownership among all classes of society, that basically there would not be classes of society, that the government would provide all the needs of the people. That is in direct contrast to Western ideals, which stress the idea of individual ownership, incentive, and working hard, and profits. So because of these differing ways of life, we had a hard time finding common ground. Marxism started in the time of the Industrial Revolution, from the late 1700s through the 1800s, in the context of people working in factories and in farms for very low wages and under terrible conditions. Karl Marx popularized his theory of communism, which he published in his book, The Communist Manifesto. This book basically outlined what the system of communism could be in a country. However, a lot of it had to do with the Russian culture as well. So sometimes we refer to Marx's ideas as Russian Marxism because of the history and the culture of the Russian people and its capital of Moscow, and the history of it contributing to Marx's ideas themselves. The Soviet Union began with Vladimir Lenin and his rise to power. We know that during World War I, Russia had to withdraw from the Allies because of an internal situation going on in their country. There was the Russian Revolution, which saw the abdication of the Tsar, and then from there was the Bolshevik Revolution, which was when the Bolsheviks were able to establish themselves in power and create the Soviet Union. Soviet basically means organization of workers, and that represents the common working class of society, and the fact that they were overthrowing this imperialist monarchical system that had been set up in Russia for so long, with the Tsars ruling them. And from that success of the Bolsheviks, the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics was formed. After the Bolsheviks were successful and renamed Russia the USSR, they then developed an organization called Comintern, which stood for Communist International. The goal of it was to direct other communist-related activities and movements worldwide, so in effort to spread what had begun in Russia and turning it into a communist state across other nations as well. And we saw the impact of Comintern in the Chinese Civil War, when they were trying to direct both the CCP and the GMD of how to make the country progress from what it had been under its monarchy. With the Great Depression, that confirmed a lot of communist views in proving that capitalist societies were bound to crumble and that workers were better off in a system of communism where the government could provide all of their needs. The Great Depression produced a lot of struggles between countries and within countries because people had very limited means of making a living, and people get desperate in that kind of situation and end up supporting ideologies which they might not have before, which is why fascism was on such a rise in the 1930s in Europe. So to many people in the Soviet Union, the Great Depression was just confirmation that they had it right and the West had it wrong. We know that our country and the Soviet Union cooperated together during World War II, albeit it was a tense cooperation. We were working towards a common enemy, Adolf Hitler, and bringing him down in Europe. This cooperation began after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is abbreviated here, MRP, was broken by Hitler when he invaded the Soviet Union with Operation Barbarossa. From that point on, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt formed what was called the Grand Alliance in order to bring down the Axis powers, specifically Nazi Germany. Throughout the latter years of World War II, we now know that there were a series of conferences held between the Big Three, as they were called, in order to discuss what the future of Europe was going to be. And in those conferences, there was a lot of disagreement and tension because of the differing ideologies and the self-interest issues that lay at hand. the Soviets were very suspicious of any type of Western domination of Europe after World War II, just as we were suspicious of any Soviet type of domination, specifically with Poland. We now know that the Soviets actually murdered many huge numbers of Poles who were trying to resist them along with the Nazis. And so the Soviets had shown themselves during World War II to be very aggressive and definitely at odds with what they had said they were trying to do, which was to free Europe, and yet they were replacing it with communism and fear. Stalin, throughout World War II, was very concerned of what the Eastern Europe countries would look like and how much influence he would have. He actually proposed a series of percentages of how much influence the Soviets would have in these different Eastern European countries as opposed to other countries in the West. There was also the suspicion of how Hitler would finally be brought down, whether he would be surrendering to the West or to the Soviet Union, given that both armies were advancing in on Germany from two different sides. So even though we were cooperating together, these different conferences at Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam proved that we had our own internal issues that we had a hard time working out. But we did have the goal of ending World War II as soon as possible. In class, we've created a chart outlining the three main conferences as far as the date and location of each, the participants at each, the issues discussed, and the decisions reached. So I would encourage you to keep that chart in your notes and use it as a reference page so that you can remember key issues that were brought up in these conferences and be able to use them effectively in essays about the origins of the Cold War. Even though we were working together to bring down Hitler and end to World War II, after that was over, we no longer had a common goal that we were working for, and therefore the Communist Bloc emerged in Eastern Europe and basically outlined the beginnings of the Cold War. The Communist Bloc referred to the countries in Eastern Europe where the Soviet Red Army had advanced in bringing down Hitler. Once these countries were quote-unquote freed by Red Army troops, it was now expected that they would be gracious to the Soviet Union and allow the Soviets to have an influence there once the war was over. Of course, our country and Churchill with the British did not like this idea, but we really didn't have a whole lot of say, being that the Red Army was physically present in these Eastern European countries already, from pushing back the Germans out of the Soviet Union. We had to pretty much agree to disagree at the conferences about what was to be the fate of Eastern Europe. Stalin had a better bargaining position given that, like I said, the Red Army was already there. And we had to pretty much accept it if we wanted his help in the finalization of World War II and the bringing down of Hitler officially, as well as the Japanese. So our objectives, while irreconcilable, it was as it was. It had to be that way because there wasn't much we could do short of forcing the Red Army out of these Eastern European countries, which probably would have prompted another world war. The Soviet objective was to spread communism. Our objective was to spread democracy and liberalism in government. And so one of us was going to win. If you look in your book, your Cold War book on page 18, you can see how things progressed in Eastern Europe, which further defined what were to be the boundaries of the Cold War initially. And you can see at the bottom of page 18 something referred to as the salami tactics, and this was basically the term given to the tactics used by the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. And it was called that because of the comment that was made that it was easy to promote and secure communist control just like it is to slice off salami piece by piece. You can see the three different stages of these salami tactics in Eastern Europe, and it started with the Soviets supervising the organization of governments, and then from there to slice off parties that had been formed, so that in the end, in stage 3, only the Communist Party was left, and these could be easily influenced by Soviet leaders, and if need be, Moscow-trained people would replace the local communists to make sure that these countries were firmly under Soviet control. This was done all across Eastern Europe with pretty much success place after place, with the exception of a few Eastern European countries. The biggest case study that this started with was, of course, Poland, which was the heart of where World War II began. It was also the secret part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or the Nazi-Soviet agreements, where the two countries would divide Poland between them. And it was also a huge part of the end of World War II when the Red Army was advancing towards Germany, and when they got to Poland, the Poles trying to resist the Germans themselves against Soviet wishes, and that ending in mass murder. Obviously, the Poles had a lot of animosity towards the Russians because of the fact that they had agreed with Hitler to divide them up initially in the war. And then from there, towards the end, when they tried to resist on their own against the Germans, the Soviets brutally put them down. The parties that existed in Poland with the elections that were supposed to be held that Stalin had agreed to at Yalta, were systematically stripped away. And you can see at the bottom of 18 and top of 19 that some of these parties, people were murdered, they were shipped off to Siberia to censor them, to shut them up basically. People were intimidated, they were threatened, and so you can't really call this a free election by any stretch of the imagination, even though that's what Stalin had agreed to. You can see at the top of page 19 that the Polish Peasant Party had 246 candidates that were just disqualified. 149 had been arrested and 18 had been murdered. Over 1 million voters were taken off the electoral register for some silly reason or another. So obviously it's easy to understand why the Communist Party in Poland was able to be successful in these so-called elections. And tactics like this were repeated over and over in other Eastern European countries. I'm going to put up on the screen, you won't see a lot of description about them in your book because this comes from the other book that I used to use, but you can have these on your PowerPoints, these other case studies of Eastern Europe, this one having to do with Romania. And you can see the same type of tactics, intimidation and fraud, rigging of elections. Here you can see what happened with Bulgaria, with Hungary, with Czechoslovakia, and with Yugoslavia, which of these Eastern European countries, Yugoslavia was one of the few that managed to remain pretty much free of Soviet control, but it was at great peril to them and to their leader, a man by the name of Joseph Brusilov, who was nicknamed Tito. I know many of you print out these slides. I would specifically ask you to do so with these Eastern European country case studies because, like I said, you won't find a lot of specific detail about them in your book, but you can see them here on the slides. Finally, let's look at some issues that happened which further hardened the lines in the Cold War, a situation that happened in Iran, first of all. You can find this on page 19 in your book, but you can see that in Tehran, that's where one of the first of the wartime conferences was held. Both the British and the Soviets had troops there during World War II, and there was a pledge made that these troops would be withdrawn 6 months after the war ended. However, Stalin left over 30,000 of his troops in the north, saying that they were needed to put down an internal rebellion. And so when it was finally demanded that Stalin to take out his troops, he refused on January 1st of 1946. He basically said that he had as much right to access ports and oil as the Allies did, and so he refused to take out his troops. At this point, the government in Tehran appealed to the newly formed UN Security Council for help, and with that kind of pressure, the Soviets finally caved in and withdrew their troops. This was in confirmation of a telegram written by George Kennan, who was a U.S. diplomat in Moscow in the years of the Cold War. He wrote a telegram which became known as the Long Telegram because it was over 4,000 words in length, and he had thoroughly analyzed Soviet history and actions during the 20th century and what they were doing at this point, and came to the conclusion that if you stand up to the Russians, they will back down. And you can see his telegram and the description of it at the bottom of page 20 along with a photo of Kennan. And this philosophy of Kennan's became the basis of the first part of the Cold War. It was what our government used to make our policies of containment, the Marshall Plan, and other types of specific decisions that we made initially in the years of the Cold War. Finally, let's look at two speeches that were made by Stalin and Churchill, which hardened the lines of the Cold War and set it into place for these first years of the end of the 40s and early 50s. We know Truman's position now. He was more hardline and aggressive in his approach to the Soviets than Roosevelt had been. Stalin made a speech which became known as the Two Worlds speech, and in that he basically validated the thoughts of Lenin and Marxism, even though he had his own brand of communism called Stalinism, that there was two hostile camps in the world, that war was going to be inevitable, and that people then had to choose which side they were going to be on. So you can see the effects of this speech down here, and that this was pretty much a declaration of the Cold War. This speech is not in your book, but you can see it highlighted here. Churchill then made a speech called the Iron Curtain speech, which you can see in your book on page 21. We're going to discuss it more in class. And he pretty much called the Soviets out there, saying what they were doing was an act of aggression, that they needed to be met with force, and that they would respond. So we'll be talking about these two speeches more and what it led to down the road.